Hi, welcome to my video about horror and what it means to me. Before we begin, sometimes I say the word horror strangely, and I know this. You may notice it. Unfortunately, there is not much either of us can do about it, so we are going to move forward together. I love horror. I do. It grips me, fascinates me, amuses me, surprises me, and especially when I find something strange that I've never seen before, or just something that, challenges my view on like a topic or an issue that I haven't considered before. I don't necessarily love horror simply for the sake of, shock value. For me, shock value has to have some actual value behind it for it to be worthwhile. But horror has accompanied me through enough parts of my life that eventually I had to ask myself what I was actually getting from it. Why would a person who has spent a great deal of her life struggling with fear deliberately choose to be frightened? And why does that sometimes feel comforting? I think the answer begins with control, not total control. Horror is actually quite good at reminding us that control is temporary, fragile, and sometimes completely imaginary. But it allowed me to choose when I entered the frightening thing. Horror let consequences be real, it let fear be real, it let the worst thing happen and say, yes, this is the story now. Even though this bad thing has happened, this is what's happening. Horror didn't even enter my life in the traditional way. I didn't grow up watching the horror classics. I didn't have older relatives or siblings who lovingly introducing me to slashers or a friend organizing horror marathons in somebody's basement. Horror was largely outside the boundaries of what I was permitted to watch. And frankly, I was also much too scared to go looking for it myself. It existed around the edges of the things I knew. There was Scooby-Doo, Gremlins, The Birds, and other movies, cartoons, and stories that stood near horror without crossing too far into it. Adults around me had briefly let their guard down. Maybe the movie was funny enough to be considered acceptable. Immediately feel liberating. It felt frightening, lonely, and much more brutal than I'd honestly expected. At this point in my life, I was going through a lot. I was trying to find work, I was trying to make a home, I was trying to understand relationships and friendships in a healthy, meaningful way, and I was trying to develop tastes and opinions that actually felt like mine. And that was kind of a novel thing for me. I mean, in the broadest possible sense, I was trying to become a person. And that was when I began watching horror more deliberately. Some of the first substantial horror films I found were The Blackcoat's Daughter, The Autopsy of Jane Doe, and As Above, So Below. For one thing, these movies happened to be visible on Netflix at the right time, but they also felt like real steps into the genre. They were not softened introductions. These weren't old classics that weren't really considered scary anymore. They were unsettling, strange, and legitimate horror movies. These were the ones that showed up on lists of oh, these are novel horror movies you have to watch, or these are unique horror movies. And those were just the lists that I was seeing at the time. But regardless, these were great first kind of entries into the horror genre for me. And I definitely had to work myself up to watching them. I would decide I was going to do it. I would gather snacks and candy, close the shades, even though it was daytime, and sit nervously in the dark with my dog beside me. It sounds small, but it was definitely a kind of ritual. ritualistic and a little significant because I was choosing fear in that moment, but I was also choosing the conditions around it. I could make the room safe. I could prepare. I could decide when the movie started. And if it became too much, I knew where the light switch was. I could look down at my phone. I could pat my dog. I could reassure myself when things started becoming a little too intense. At first, I thought I was testing myself. Could I handle this? Was I brave enough? Was I becoming the person I'd promised myself that I would become? But horror also was helping me to create an identity. I was learning what disturbed me, what bored me, what fascinated me, and what stayed with me after the credits ended. The world itself was not new, but for the first time, it felt like it was opening up to me, and specifically through the pathway of horror movies. I was kind of experiencing a lot of things that really had felt completely new, and I was experiencing things in a way that felt more tactile, maybe, for the first time. And as I kept watching horror movies and eventually watching more like horror TV series, I also discovered that the genre gave me something I hadn't really expected. It gave fear a structure. Because in real life, emotional pain can be confusing. You may not know what caused it, when it will end, what it means, or what you're supposed to do with it. You can spend a great deal of time trying to prevent every possible disaster without ever knowing which disaster is coming. And sometimes horror is often more honest. I mean, the devil wants something, the ghost has a history, the curse has a pattern, the final girl has to endure. The characters that sneak away and do things that they shouldn't, at least in the scope of the movie, experience consequences. Fate arrives, consequences are real in horror movie settings, regardless if the consequences are fair or justified or appropriate or whatever. It's still the reality that consequences do happen. I mean, these worlds were not reassuring because they were hopeful. They were reassuring because they were certain. I didn't have to protect the doomed college students. I didn't have to prevent the ghost from entering the house or fix the family who had already moved into the obviously haunted property despite every possible visible warning sign. The story had already begun, the consequences already in motion. For someone who often felt responsible for anticipating and preventing catastrophe, that was a relief. It removed the burden of believing every bad outcome could have been avoided if only I had been more vigilant. And later, I went through one of the most significant heartbreaks of my adult life. And believe me, the complete story is not necessarily a fun one. But I lived that breakup. I felt it. It hurt very badly. It was a doozy. And that's when I committed to watching horror quite a bit. I watched Halloween for the first time. I also watched We've Always Lived in the Castle, which exists somewhere between gothic drama, thriller, and horror, depending on how determined you are to categorize it. But that movie stands out as a very significant memory for that processing of that particular heartbreak. I remember it. It's such a tactile memory. The snacks, the glass of wine, my dog, and the general feeling of sadness, but that escape that movie provided. Just perfectly appropriate for that point in my life. These movies did not change my life in a clean, dramatic way. I'm not saying We've Always Lived in the Castle was this balm, this solution. These movies were touch points. They arrived while I was trying to process what had happened, grieve it, and simply get through the days in the manner that, a girl processing a breakup you just gotta get through it. There isn't another way except through it. I kept reaching for horror because it allowed me to feel what I was feeling without directly repeating my own life back to me. I didn't have to, re experience stories and plots that just reminded me of sad romantic stories. I've never really understood the impulse to watch romantic comedies after a breakup. Like, I know it's a very real thing that some people use to process, and I just don't get it. I mean, the feelings in those movies aren't yours anymore. You can't relate to those feelings of being in love in the same way. So it's never really made sense. I mean, the emotional logic just felt inaccessible to me. Movies about relationships are so much worse. They came too close to the actual wound, and I couldn't bring myself to be that vulnerable yet. I mean, horror approached grief at an angle. It gave me hauntings, murders, curses, monsters, doomed families, people running through the dark from monsters. Like, I obviously could not relate to the literal circumstances, but I related to the intensity. Horror gave me a place to feel misery, sadness, fear, shock, survival, and release without requiring me to sit inside the precise story of what had happened to me. I didn't have to relive the breakup. I could escape through the story. There was enough distance for recognition and enough artifice for me to see myself in the emotions without having to see myself in the story. That heartbreak taught me I could survive a level of heartbreak and emotional pain that I didn't previously couldn't imagine and didn't think I could get through. It was an unfortunate but important lesson of adulthood. And at the time, I was still learning how to hold large emotions without collapsing beneath them. Horror helped me to do that. Not by curing the feelings or making them beautiful, or giving it this sad, dramatic, glossy cover. It simply gave them somewhere to exist. Later, horror changed again. It stopped being an occasional task or something I reached for during more crisis-type moments. It became part of everyday life. My partner and I watched movies together, our dog nearby, eventually our cats. There were snacks, drinks, evenings marked on calendars, and the quiet safety of having my partner beside me while we watched the scary movie. Horror became a more domestic thing for me. It became something shared inside of a rather happy life. And that gave me room to recognize that horror was doing more than helping me prove I could withstand fear. It was also changing how I thought. So, for example, Hereditary was one of the first films that made that especially clear. At first, it appears to be a film about grief, family trauma, mourning, mental illness, and inherited damage. Then the movie slowly removes nearly every possibility of emotional safety. What looks like mourning begins to resemble manipulation. What looks like family dysfunction begins to resemble inheritance. What looks like choice begins to look like choreography. The film does not only show a family collapsing, it suggests that they may have been inside the collapse long before they understood what was happening. No one gets like a happy ending besides the demon. And I would imagine that he's probably pretty content with how things play out. But what stayed with me was the way that the film destabilized its own meaning. Like, I thought I understood what kind of story I was watching, and then the final revelations changed the rules of that story retroactively. The family's pain was real, but it was also part of a mechanism that they could not see. And that's one of horror's most powerful abilities. Now, the movie It Follows entered my life almost kind of accidentally. I put it on while working on a paper for grad school because at the time I needed like a movie to occupy the restless part of my attention, the ADHD neurodivergent goblin. It needed something to glob onto. And instead, the movie globbed onto me. This movie dragged me in. And what stayed with me was its bleak certainty. The characters could understand the threat and learn its rules, but understanding it didn't remove it. Survival didn't restore the world to its prior state of innocence. There might always be something walking behind them. And perhaps that is why it remains such a clear touchpoint for me. I mean, discovery does not guarantee comfort. Understanding why something is happening does not always make it stop. You see, horror movies were never this, like I said before, this great balm, a solution, a clear finish to everything. They simply existed at certain touch points in my life and gave me a kind of vessel to understand what I was feeling and conceptualize different concepts. We move through different kinds of horror, including older films like Alien. You know, I was no longer watching these movies to prove that I could just handle something scary. I was watching because I was curious, because the films were interesting, and because sharing them had become part of our life together. When I lost my dog, Regal, in 2024, the first movie I watched was The Substance. And it was a strange, somewhat ridiculous choice for the first day of grieving my dog. But I could pretend that the movie carried some enormous symbolic meaning for me. Mostly it kept me going, and sometimes that is enough. Sometimes they allowed me to express a feeling, a desire, a sense of self through my connection to something that I considered terrible. You know, these movies don't represent happy, rosy pictures. It's terrible realities and scenarios where these types of things exist that are capable of creating all kinds of evil and things to be afraid of. These movies gave fear a shape, and sometimes they let me feel grief indirectly. And I'll say it a third time, you know? Horror movies were never this solution, this clean finish to everything. They simply existed at certain touch points. They allowed me to express feelings, a sense of self, giving fear a shape. And they showed me the mechanism beneath the story I thought I understood. These movies were sometimes just there at the right moment, but nowadays they're kind of permanent memories, like connections to the person I was when I watched them. At first, I came to horror because I think I wanted that sense of control in a life that felt like it didn't have a lot of control to it, where everything felt like it was kind of just happening to me. I used it to cope during difficult times. And then eventually, when life changed and it became more stable, and I had changed quite a bit, I began to value horror films as art because it was willing to disturb, confront, and rearrange what I thought I knew. Discovery does not guarantee comfort, and understanding a mechanism does not always free us from it. Just because we understand why we do something doesn't mean we're necessarily going to stop doing it, unless we've really changed kind of the why behind it. But just because it's difficult to free ourselves from these mechanisms, or just because these systems in power seem so intimidating, it doesn't mean that there isn't something on the other side of that threshold. Horror doesn't comfort me by pretending there is nothing to fear. It comforts me by admitting that fear is real and still making a story out of the act of facing it. I know fear in my life. I've known fear many different times. I know elements of darkness. I know change can cost something, but I'm still going to look. I'm still going to understand, and I'm still going to try to move forward. And that is some of what horror, the genre, has given to me over the course of many years. That's kind of my retrospective on a lifetime of touch points, a lifetime of horror movies, and some of the gifts it has given me.